أنا جون هوفر. أنا بروفيسور في الدراسات الإسلامية عند جامعة نوتنغهام في إنجلترا. آم، أنا أدرس مجالات الفلسفة والكلام، وأنا متخصص في ابن تيمية and ابن قيم الجوزية. Mutahari was an activist, and he was speaking to the youth of his day. He was trying to, in Iran at that time, there's lots of atheism and Marxism, 1960s, 1970s, and he was trying to get people to see the rationality of religion who are secularizing, and he's hoping that this Avicennan discourse, through Mullah Sadr, of course, will bring them to faith or bring them back into the religious tradition. We begin with what is the most amazing, if you will, and that is God himself, and work down from there instead of looking at the world and working up. So Mutahari makes that point quite strongly. So it relies on believing this fundamental point that God is existent and that God necessarily is the most perfect or pure goodness. Yeah, I think we have to put aside this image of Ibn Taymiyyah as a totally hateful man. Rather, he's a man deeply persuaded by his own perspective. He's working it out. He doesn't have everything figured out from his early days. He's working it out, and you pick that up like the Fanaء and Nar issue. Frankly, his big complaint about theologians is they don't give God adequate praise. They portray God in ways which detract from worshiping God appropriately. For him, the annihilation that is proper is the annihilation of doing deeds for anyone but God. So all of our deeds are annihilated, which are devoted to other gods or other aims apart from the aims that God has given us. So he changes the meanings of certain Sufi terms to fit within his much more moralistic, ethical framework, encouraging you on that journey of giving your whole life energy to God, not seeking this unity with God ontologically that we have in Sufism more broadly. On my reading, his ontology, his understanding of God's, of who God is fundamentally different from the Kalam tradition. He's not Platonist in the broadest of terms. He is, if I may use the word, materialist.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that exists must be potentially seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled. Everything is accessible to the five senses. Angels and all even our souls we don't have an immaterial soul. Now, our soul is not something you can see, but it is nonetheless material. It's extracted from us when we die. And if we have, in certain circumstances, we could perhaps see it. It's a fundamentally different view of reality than the dominant, what is dominant within both Sunni tradition and the Shia traditions. Yes, there's a lot of similarities with modern materialisms, with the key difference that he believes in God, and he has a way of understanding God within his materialistic framework. So he provides a way to believe in God for materialists.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. We are interviewing today Professor Jon Hoover, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at Nottingham University in the UK. His areas of special interest includes Islamic intellectual history, medieval Islamic theology and philosophy, and mainly the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and also Christian-Muslim theological interaction. He has been teaching courses on interpreting Islam, Islamic theology and philosophy, Muslims and others. He has several publications such as The Muslim Theologian, Ibn Taymiyyah on God, Time and Creation, foundations of Ibn Taymiyyah's religious utilitarianism, Ibn Taymiyyah's use of Ibn Rushd to refute the incorporealism of Fakhruddin al-Razi, Ibn Taymiyyah between moderation and radicalism, a Muslim conflict over universal salvation, and Murtaza Mutahhari's solution to the problem of evil. So, Assalamu alaikum and welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So in the beginning, tell us more about yourself, a summary of your academic, religious, spiritual journey in life and your travels. You've been in Beirut, you've been also in Cairo, you learned Arabic language, and the initial point where you were interested in Islamic studies, philosophy, and theology. And from many Islamic scholars that you've studied, like Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and others, why you chose Ibn Taymiyyah and you specialized and you presented many studies on him specifically. So tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So I did my undergraduate work in the United States in mechanical engineering, but as the American curriculum works, you have a lot of scope for studying in the humanities and social sciences, and that's what I did. I studied, did some Middle Eastern history and some other topics, and then that led me into a master's degree in theology and ethics, and eventually I was in Cairo studying Arabic and teaching English, and I think it was 1995 or 1996, I came across this book, which really began my journey with Ibn al-Qayyim at first. So this book is called Alam al-Jinn wa Shayateen, by Suleiman Ashkar, a Jordanian scholar. And from my theological studies, I'd been interested in the problem of evil. And I just paged through this book. It was on a street vendor in Cairo. I was, I like to walk around the streets of Cairo and look at the books on offer in the shops as well as on the streets. And this I found on the street in Midan Abbasiyya, if anybody knows Cairo. And I picked it up and looked through it, and I came to this chapter at the very end called Al-Hikmah min Khalq Shaitan. And as I examined it, it took a little while, I discovered it came from a chapter in a book by Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who lived in the 14th century. In his book, Shifa al-Alil, on the problem of predestination and the problem of evil. If God is just and God is all-powerful, what about evil? So then I discovered that Ibn Taymiyyah was the teacher of Ibn al-Qayyim. I mean, this is a process of perhaps 2 years. I'm learning my way. And so I went and did I went to the University of Birmingham, 1998, to do a PhD in Islamic theology, Islamic studies. And I wanted to study Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah on the problem of evil. Quickly, I discovered Ibn Taymiyyah had so much stuff, I dropped Ibn al-Qayyim. And that was my PhD and my first book eventually, Ibn Taymiyyah's Theodicy, a Perpetual Optimism. And then when that was finally published in 2007, I dropped Ibn Taymiyyah for a while. And I went back to Ibn al-Qayyim. I published an article on this very chapter I mentioned, on God's creation of Iblis, or the Shaitan, and another article or two on Ibn al-Qayyim. But I wanted to get back to Ibn Taymiyyah. And so I got a grant here in the UK in 2012, 2013 to study his Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah. And that has then led to further work on the question of God's attributes and the relationship of God to space. And the publications on that have just been coming out very recently. So a big article in 2022. Before that, I've also done work on Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim in their writings on Christianity. I did things coming out of the theodicy train on the Fanaء and Nar issue, the annihilation of hellfire. All that was in the late noughties, 2009 was the first article on that, and then the last article on that was 2015. So, and then I published a book in 2018 on Ibn Taymiyyah's life and thought with One World Press. So that's a bit of my journey. It's just been an exploration where I discover that these two thinkers thought things which other people weren't thinking, or at least not in the same way. And so it was a matter of discovery. Well, what really are they saying? Instead of just polemicizing against them. I found them very, very rich thinkers, if you're willing to think with them.
Interesting. And before we delve more into the ideas and thoughts of Ibn Taymiyyah and his character, tell us more about you personally in terms of your religious and spiritual belief and practice and journey. And so your society, I guess, you live in Christian societies and you study mainly Islam and Ibn Taymiyyah. So what about yourself and your personal faith?
Right. So I'm a Christian, and I have an article which I published 2009 or 2010 called Islamic Monotheism and the Trinity, where I explain what it means to be a Trinitarian Christian in light of Islamic thought. But my main scholarly interest is Islamic thought. I'm not an expert Christian theologian. And in terms of my personal faith, I can say that interacting with Islamic thought has made me think as a Christian about a whole variety of things in new ways. It's been a very rich journey in dialogue with the Islamic tradition. Makes me go back and think about my own faith in deeper ways. So it's a interreligious exchange within myself, you might say, which has been very stimulating and encouraging for my own journey of faith.
We witness a phenomenon that several prominent Western scholars and philosophers in the academia, when they study Islam or Sufism or spirituality or even other aspects of Islamic studies, they transform or change, or they become Muslim, or they start practicing fasting and praying, or they immerse totally in the Islamic understanding, and especially from the spiritual dimensions, or they become somewhere between both religions. So what about yourself? Or this question wasn't a question for you, or no, you stayed or you strengthened your understanding of your own religion?
Yeah, so interaction with Muslims and the tradition of Islam has challenged my faith, has challenged me to grow. I mean, in terms of fundamentals of faith, I believe that Jesus Christ was the fullest revelation of God. So that's just an outright faith claim that is not the same as confessing that the Prophet Muhammad was the prophet of God and was the Quran. God revealed the Quran to him. So, if you begin, and they're 600 years apart, roughly speaking. So I have a different beginning for my faith and history than Muslims do. But beyond that, then there's lots of scope for interaction. There's lots of scope for mutual growth and mutual encouragement. So, no, I don't find myself halfway in between, or I guess that's what you're getting at. I have deep respect for what I've observed among Muslims and love for the tradition and so on. I wouldn't study this if I didn't like it. But it is my own confessional faith is, as I said, it's rooted in a different historical moment.
And what about then when you studied Islamic studies, you emphasized too much about Ibn Taymiyyah specifically. So you told us the story and why that, but obviously over the experience you encountered Ibn Arabi, Rumi, Ghazali, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd, and this is mentioned in your interests. So why only Ibn Taymiyyah, or no, maybe Ibn Taymiyyah is in these 10 or 15 years, and then you will go to different scholars?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. Um, it began for me with Ibn Taymiyyah in Cairo. I discovered, as I said, this book, which then led to everything else. So when I did my PhD, I was really into Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim at first. And as I read Ibn Taymiyyah, I realized that he's not speaking in a vacuum. He's not writing in a vacuum. I had to learn about his context. So I learned about his historical context, the Mamluk Empire, for example, but also his intellectual context. And it was very apparent that Ibn al-Arabi, for example, is very important. So I took time aside and I read Ibn al-Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam in Arabic, and thought about that, for a stretch. Fakhruddin Razi was on my horizon, but not to the degree that was strong enough yet. Ibn Sina was not yet on my horizon adequately. So when I finished my PhD, then that was a big project, is learn about Ibn Sina. Not that I learned him very well, but I did the best I could to get a grasp of what Ibn Sina was all about, so I could finish the book and publish the book with some intelligent observations about Ibn Taymiyyah's relationship to Ibn Sina. Very helpful in this process was the work of Yahya Misho, who of course was an expert in Ibn Sina and Ibn Taymiyyah. Yahya Misho was my external examiner when I did my PhD at the University of Birmingham, and he highlighted this lack of my knowledge of Ibn Sina. So that was he was really helpful in pointing that out and getting me on the right track in terms of Ibn Sina. In the meantime, I've learned a bit about Ibn Rushd and his import for Ibn Taymiyyah. So it's Ibn Taymiyyah is my beginning point, and then I learned about all these other figures. I need to say I never took a class in philosophy before I got into these figures, in my earlier education. So it's been a journey of learning that I didn't really plan on systematically. It's a matter of one thing leading to the next and discovering a whole world, which is really quite fascinating. And I discover in the process that not uncontroversial as well. So I'm simply trying to understand what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying and why he's saying it, and within its historical context, and then put it out there and try to understand. I'm fundamentally an intellectual historian who's trying to understand things in a historical context, but in today's world, of course, these ideas also have power, and some people find them fascinating, some people find them infuriating. So I'm a part of that conversation as well, you might say.
Interesting. And my final question in this introduction would be about the problem of evil. It's clear that for a period of time it was one of your main questions, and also you wrote an article about مرتضى Mطهري, solution to the problem of evil. So why it was an issue for you, and if you just summarize the main results that you wrote about solving this problem.
Yes, so I think the article on Mutahari 2015 is probably the last thing I wrote in The Problem of Evil. This was a long story before that. I lived in Cairo for quite some time. And Cairo is a city of great contrasts, great wealth and great poverty. So, I was wrestling with that. I was wrestling a lot of questions about economic disparities, the unfairness, the injustice of the world. And so that's the larger personal journey I've been on. And then, so the problem of evil, I did my main work on Ibn Taymiyyah. The Ibn Taymiyyah's Theodicy of Perpetual Optimism is my largest work on the problem of evil. I have this article on the question of why God created Iblis in Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. The whole question of hellfire is another aspect of the problem of evil. And then you come to this, I happened upon Mutahari's book on divine justice in English. Of course, he has it also in Farsi and Arabic. It's an important book. Yeah. So was like, okay, this is not usual in my area. It's not Sunni Islam, it's not Taymiyyah studies and so forth. But it caught my attention for the following reason. Motahari is an activist, a very important figure in the Iranian revival in the 1960s, 1970s, religious revival, 1960s, 1970s, and he's very close to Ayatollah Khomeini in the revolution, 1979. He was assassinated in 79. Here's a major figure who is really persuaded by the likes of Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadra, a highly philosophized approach to the problem of evil, to the whole of religious thought. Now, here's the issue. Motahari was an activist, and he was speaking to the youth of his day. He was trying to, in Iran at that time, there's lots of atheism and Marxism, 1960s, 1970s, and he was trying to get people to see the rationality of religion so that they won't be lost to secularization. And how's he do this? He comes with this medieval thought, this medieval philosophy, Ibn Sina. And now the thing here is, in Ibn Sina's time, this was an esoteric tradition. You didn't share this stuff with the commonality, with the ordinary people. It might confuse them. But here's Motahari in modern times, sharing this far and wide with ordinary people, educated people, to be fair. They weren't just people who were uneducated completely, but the engineers and lawyers in Iran who are secularizing, and he's hoping that this Avicennan discourse, through Mullah Sadr, of course, will bring them to faith or bring them back into the religious tradition. So that was fascinating. I don't have an answer to the question, what happens to an esoteric tradition when it becomes popularized? The other aspect of Motahari that struck me was that quite often this kind of view of, okay, so Ibn Sina, Mullah Sadra, Motahari, they all argue that this is the best of all possible worlds, that we explain evil as simply the absence of good. So God is perfect goodness, and from the perfect cause flows emanates the world. And as Motahari is fond of saying, from one only one can come, because if more than one comes from the one, then you're going to have plurality within the one. So we can't have that. So you have a whole stream of, you have the world emanating from God. And this world is just perfect as it is. It is beautiful. It is wonderful. And it couldn't be better than it is, because something better, you can't get anything better from the best. Now, if this world is the best possible, why bother to change it? So it can lead, people can read this kind of theodicy and say, well, it's just the best it is. I can't do anything about it. I might as well just be quietist, politically speaking. But that's exactly the opposite of what Motahari was. So, how do we explain this discrepancy? Motahari, in his writing in that book, Divine Justice, talks about this, the fact that the world isn't perfect from our perspective. We find all sorts of challenges in this life. Life isn't easy. And he says that is the way it should be, to keep us growing, to keep us stretching, to develop piety and so forth. So the world being best possible means that we need struggle. And so his activism grows out of that, that sense that the world, that we are part of the world struggle. Not, that's maybe the wrong way of putting it, but it is foreordained. It's part of the best possible world that we do struggle. We are active. We are, fighting evil and trying to build piety, build religiosity, and so forth. So I found that very fascinating, in light of the fact, as I said already, that quite often this kind of theodicy is connected with quietism, political quietism, or religious quietism as well. So that's my fascination with Motahari.
And in terms of his book, العدل الإلهي, divine justice, and the problem of evil itself, and the proofs that he was presenting, for example, that evil is not absolute, it's relative, or it's عدم, so أمر عدمي, and these stuff. So how did he present it, and what were his strongest proofs, and do you feel that it's persuasive and convincing from a philosophical manner?
Well, I kind of already indicated his overall argument. It's from the one, only one can come. And then from that, you have the whole of creation. And in order for creation, in order for the world to be the best possible, you need opposites. You can't know the good without the evil. You can't know light without darkness. You can't know beauty without ugliness, and so forth. So this is how he explains evil, or at least what we perceive to be evil, because absolute evil doesn't exist. I'm not going to speak to whether that's persuasive or not, because I find all theodicies have their weaknesses and their strengths. So if you're Mu'tazili, it's a bit different. If you're Ash'ari, it's a bit different. Each one is emphasizing something different. What the Avicennan theodicy is arguing is that because God is the perfect cause, the creation is perfect as well. So if you believe God is absolute perfection, then this is persuasive that the creation will be necessarily the most wonderful. And Mutahari makes this point that unlike the Kalam theologians, the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris, Ibn Sina and the philosophical tradition begins not with us. It doesn't begin by looking out at the world and saying, oh, how wonderful the trees are, how wonderful the sunshine is, how beautiful the flowers are. This is more a Ghazalian approach. Al-Ghazali begins this way, look at the beauty of the insects, the gnat, for example, just amazing. No, we begin with what is the most amazing, if you will, and that is God himself, and work down from there instead of looking at the world and working up. So Mutahari makes that point quite strongly. You might say that's not very persuasive because, well, you can't see God. So it relies on believing this fundamental point that God is existent and that God necessarily is the most perfect or pure goodness. Yeah, that's his argument in a nutshell. Whether it's persuasive, I leave to the listener.
And in your general understanding, after studying several scholars who solved the problem of evil, how do you understand it, or how was it solved for you personally?
Yeah, so I believe the world is fundamentally good. It's a good creation of God, but it is broken. And we have a part to play in that there's the story of Adam and Eve, of course, and the fall, and there's lots of evidence of evil. It's one of them. Some theologians said, there's nothing more obvious than the fact that there's a lot of evil in the world. So I quite like the book of Job in the Bible, where there's a lot of protesting, but yet there's this fundamental acknowledgement, yeah, God's fundament is in charge at the end of the day. There's also the idea in Christianity that God is with us in Christ, Jesus Christ incarnate. And so that's an act of solidarity on the part of God with humanity, ultimately on the cross. And then in the resurrection, there's victory over that death. There's victory over death and all evil, which is still being worked out. So I don't have an answer to the problem of evil like Mutahari does. I mean, he writes in his book, problem solved. No, I don't have an answer like that. I rather see God working in the world, and we also work in the world to improve things, to work things out. There's a verse in the Bible somewhere about God being very patient. So God is giving us time to work things out, to get our act together. And that's why the world, many people say, if God is all good and God is all powerful, why isn't it perfect by now? Or why isn't it better by now? Well, so this answer is that God is giving us time to work things out, get our act together ourselves. Because if God put an end to everything now, there'd be a lot of people who would not have had that opportunity to, work things through. So that's think about the best I can give you. That it's a process. We're on a journey as humanity, as individuals, in answering this question for ourselves, and God is giving us a lot of time to work on it.
Interesting. So in this second part, I'd like to delve more with you about Ibn Taymiyyah himself. So I'll just read a certain introduction about him, and then I'll start the questions. He is Taqiyuddin Ahmed Ibn Taymiyyah, a jurist and theologian in the 13th and 14th century. He had very harsh criticism to anything he considered bid'ah, including Shi'ism, many aspects of Sufism. He was born in Harran in modern Turkey, and then spent most of his life in Damascus, Syria. He's a controversial character. He's considered from the Hanbali school in law, and later he had his special views on different topics. So he had fatwas against Nusayri, Alawi, Durzi people, where he states that they were heretics, and their repentance cannot be accepted, and they should be killed wherever they are found. So this created many enemies for him. He was accused of tajssim, where he states that God has human attributes. He was also present because of that and because of other issues. Several times he was present in his life. He was also known for criticizing Shi'i and Sufi and other Muslims' practice of visiting the shrines of saints. One of his main students is Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who carried his ideas and thoughts even in a more forceful way. He was also the first to criticize the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud and attacking Ibn Arabi. He was the first one to use this term in describing Ibn Arabi and other mystical views. He accused them for kufr by stating that they believe that God and creation is the same thing. Even Allah, Ibn Ata'illah Secondary, who was a significant leader of Shadili order, and a Sufi scholar who has Al-Hikam al-Ata'iyya, this famous book. So Ibn Ata'illah and his students protested against Ibn Taymiyyah, and it's mentioned in history that they had a formal debate, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Ata'illah. So this is several ideas or thoughts or stereotypes which are mentioned usually when Ibn Taymiyyah comes into mind. But regardless of that, I'd like to ask you as a specialist in Ibn Taymiyyah about the political, social, cultural, historical context where Ibn Taymiyyah came in and lived in, and his project in general. So the main elements that you discovered in your study about the context that Ibn Taymiyyah lived in and what he achieved and was successful in and influential in, and what he maybe wasn't so much successful in achieving, and his personality and why he was present several times. And so it's clear that he was attacking Sufis and Wahdat al-Wujud and Ibn Ata'illah. So this also indicates that these ideas and the Sufi or some Shia ideas were prominent and were important in those times. So he had he believed that he had a role in attacking it and such. So in the beginning, before tackling his ideas like Fanaء, النار, or his idea about وحدة الوجود or Salafism, or how then the Salafi groups used his ideas, let us understand his context, and then I'll ask you other questions.
Okay, thank you. So it's really important to understand that his context in Syria and Cairo was highly pluralistic. You ran in your introduction there, you introduced all kinds of different names of groups and so forth. So you have, in addition to Sunni Muslims and Sunni Islam, as Sunni Islam was still in the process of clarifying its identity. And so you have Shiism in Mount Lebanon. You have Christians in a variety of places. In Egypt, for example, there's still, a large percentage of Christians. It's a big question as to when Muslims became more than 50% of the population of the Middle East more broadly, and Egypt in particular. But if we think of Christians being today about 10% of the population, it was much, much more than that in the late 1200s, early 1300s. And you have Jews, of course. So, excuse me. There's this diversity. Then you've got the Mongols coming in from the east. And this threatens, of course, there's a battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, which where the Mamluks turned back the Mongols. But then the Mongols kept coming at other points, and there was a big invasion of 1299. And then another invasion, basically 1299 to 1303, there were several Mongol invasions in which Ibn Taymiyyah was participating against, with the Mamluks against the Mongols. He was advocating for jihad. He even participated in battle on certain occasions. So there's this context where he felt the Mamluk society, which was militarily strong, but he perceived it to be also religiously weak. And so he was really worried that the Mamluks won't rise to the occasion adequately to oppose the Mongols. Well, why might that be? Well, the Mongols had converted to Islam. Ghazan, the Ilkhanids were the Mongol rulers of Persia and Iraq. And their king, if you will, Ghazan, had converted to Islam in 1295. So now the Mongols are Muslims, and Ibn Taymiyyah was facing, at least from his writings, we perceive that there are people saying, well, we shouldn't be fighting fellow Muslims. Besides, rising up in battle against this vast Mongol horde, it's quite, is this worth it, you might say. Ibn Taymiyyah's argument, yes, it's definitely worth that we need to oppose these Mongols. And his argumentation comes out of their defective religion. So backing up a little bit more, Mongol policy in Persia, Iraq, and wherever else they ruled was to treat all religions the same. This destabilized the status quo of the areas they ruled, particularly Persia and Iraq, because the Sunnis were dominant. So we go back a little bit. You have the time of Al-Ghazali, the Seljuks, and so forth. That's when the Sunnis gained the upper hand, clearly, in those regions, Persia, Iraq. And the Mongols come along and they level everybody. So Shias and Christians receive equal standing with Sunnis. Sunnis are degraded from their former power. This unnerves the Sunnis a bit. So that's a bigger background to this unease which Ibn Taymiyyah has. Ibn Taymiyyah accuses the Mongols of making all religions equal, and in some sense they did, although they from Ghazan onward they confessed Islam. So Ibn Taymiyyah's analysis is that all this plurality within the Mamluk realm, Syria and Egypt. By plurality, we're talking about the emergence of saint veneration. We're talking about Ibn Arabi, a century earlier, and all the thinking that came out from him. He had followers of people that taking his thought in different directions. The Kalam theologians are speculating on all kinds of things which are not working in Ibn Taymiyyah's view. Frankly, his big complaint about theologians is they don't give God adequate praise. They portray God in ways which detract from worshiping God appropriately. They're a distraction, you might put it very bluntly. And Shias, of course, he didn't think that their imamology was correct because it derogated from the authority of the Khulafat Rashidun and all of that. So, yeah, conclusion, society is failing, we're failing because our religion is failing. And our weakness politically is down to the fact that our religion is inadequate. So how do we solve the problem? We need to reform it. How do we reform it? We go back to the origins. We go back to the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Salaf, and everything that doesn't fit that, according to Ibn Taymiyyah's vision, is bid'ah, as you mentioned in your introduction. So a good example of this is the Prophet, commemorating the Prophet's birthday, Mawlid an-Nabi. He did not think that was part of the original religion of Islam. It's something that emerged afterwards. His opponent said, this is a bid'ah hasana, this is a good innovation. Nobody said it went back to the Prophet, of course, or his companions, but it's a good thing. Whereas he said, no, it's not part of the original religion, therefore it's not part of Islam, therefore it shouldn't be practiced. And so his life, his adult life vocation was to advocate theologically in his writings, advocate, he was activist. Sometimes he destroyed certain holy objects or something like that with his buddies. So he was, he opposed things which he thought were detracting from the true religion, which then led to his imprisonment on a couple of occasions, as you mentioned. So in brief, that's the context.
But what led to his prison several times? So he was prisoned because of his ideas and thoughts that were affecting people, or so why the political power care about a scholar who's thinking in a certain way or imposing ideas, and several times even. Or there were people on the other side that were talking to the politicians that to make him present, and
So the first imprisonment was due to his ideas on God. He was accused of tajseem, which is corporealism, or giving God saying God is some kind of body, which is what I'm working on primarily when I have time these days. So that was in 1298. And no, he wasn't in prison at that point. He was simply arrested and then released. But in 1306, he was tried for this. He was sent to Cairo. He was tried in Cairo, and then he was imprisoned for a year and a half. And then he was in and out of prison in Cairo for a year or two thereafter. I am still working on why that was so threatening to the even political authorities. First of all, it really upset the scholars. So he's a religious scholar. He's a Hanbali religious scholar. He's not Ash'ari. Best as I can tell, Ash'ari theology was the dominant theology in Damascus and Cairo at the time. And what he said and did went against it, and he would not back down. So that created a ruckus, a commotion within the scholarly community, which then spilled out into wider society, to the point that the Mamluk authorities felt they had to intervene. And there was, I outlined this in my 2018 book on Ibn Taymiyyah, what we know about the details of his enemies conniving and plotting to undo him. I'm not going to go into that here. Perhaps a clearer, we don't know exactly beyond what I just said why he was in prison then. A clear example is his views on triple talaq, or triple divorce. Yusuf Rappaport, a professor at Queen Mary University in London, has done some really interesting work on this. Ibn Taymiyyah said that oaths under triple talaq, you swear an oath that I'll divorce my wife 3 times if I break my oath to the Sultan. So Ibn Taymiyyah, by saying triple divorce counts only as 1, was basically destroying the oath. So let me rephrase that. If a man swears allegiance to the Sultan on pain of triple divorce, in other words, if he breaks his oath to the Sultan, he has to divorce his wife 3 times, which is irrevocable. The wife is gone. And she has to marry another man if she has any hope of returning to her original husband, and then divorce from another man as well. Rappaport is showing that Ibn Taymiyyah, by saying actually that triple divorce doesn't count, but for one talaq. In other words, it doesn't really remove the wife for good. He's undermining the whole loyalty system of the Mamluk society. So a man who says, I swear allegiance to the Sultan on pain of triple divorce, let's say he breaks his oath and he tries to divorce his wife 3 times, and Ibn Taymiyyah says that only counts as one. And that means the whole system doesn't work anymore. So Rappaport is arguing Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned because of that, because he was attacking the foundations of Mamluk society. So that's a pretty, a clear example. He was imprisoned for more than a year and a half at the end of his life because his followers got a bit too zealous in condemning the cult of saints. And he was implicated, of course, because the ideas were coming from him, and then he was imprisoned. But again, it's a matter of people in power fearing that the disturbance caused by these ideas will undermine public order or perhaps undermine certain political and economic interests. But we don't have enough information to say a great deal more than that.
Mm-hmm. How was
particular people's ideas and what particular people did, but yeah, exactly what was going on is perhaps beyond what we can know exactly.
Mm-hmm. How was his relations or interactions with the Shi'i scholars or Shi'i groups? Was there any? And then what's the reason beyond his, between parentheses, hatred for Ahlul Bayt or Imam Ali specifically? Because several scholars, when they study, whether Shi'i scholars or even Sufi or other scholars, when they analyze his ideas and thoughts and writings about the family of the Prophet and specifically Imam Ali, they feel or they conclude that he has a certain hatred towards Ali. So what's your results in your study and what's the reason beyond that?
Yes, so I haven't actually studied this question, so I can't speak too much to it. So the biggest work that Ibn Taymiyyah wrote on Shi'ism is his Manhaj as-Sunnah an-Nabawiyya. And Alama al-Hilli wrote a treatise against Sunni Islam. And Alama al-Hilli was a 14th century important scholar in the 14th century in theology, more Mu'tazili. And he wrote, I don't know why he wrote it, I haven't studied this as well, but he wrote this refutation of Sunnism, which basically in theology was attacking Ash'ari theology. For some reason, Ibn Taymiyyah got this tract and he wrote a much, much longer response called Manhaj as-Sunnah an-Nabawiyya. So that's his main work, which I haven't studied. I've read bits of it relevant to the problem of evil. And it actually remains to be studied in full to respond to the very question that you're raising. There's been some work that's shown that Ibn Taymiyyah's knowledge of Shi'i imamology is quite accurate. And he knows a lot about 12er Shi'ism or Imami Shi'ism, but that doesn't really answer your question. So one thing I can say is he got harsher with time. So his earlier writings, some of little tracts in the early 1300s, he doesn't takfir them. He doesn't, call them unbelievers. But later he gets a little bit harsher. And it's, of course, people today, they read the harshest stuff that he wrote, not the softer stuff in developing their ideas. So I'm aware in Arabic, there are refutations of his work from Shi'i scholars. I haven't studied that material. That's a big field, open field in my view for further research.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what about the intersection relation gaining from Ibn Arabi? Because some researchers discovered that many of his ideas are either taken from or is jawab wa rad ala Ibn Arabi. There are many intersections, and they say you can find many parts of the Futuhat, just Ibn Taymiyyah took them from Ibn Arabi and reproduce them or بالعكس. So in another way or in a paradoxical way, he presented the ideas, but there was a certain kind of interaction. And then they'll talk about the idea of فناء النار, and then Ibn Arabi talked about it, then Ibn Taymiyyah talked about it a century after. So what do you discover here?
Right. Excuse me. So it's important to know that Ibn Taymiyyah liked reading the Futuhat. For the first almost 40 years of his life. He said he gained much from it. But then he discovered the Fusus al-Hikam, which is a much shorter work, and that opened his eyes to the problems in Ibn al-Arabi. So this is around 1303, 1304, 1305, in that period. And the problem he discovered was that Ibn Arabi doesn't use the word wahdat al-wujud, but Ibn Taymiyyah does, and some people who came after Ibn al-Arabi, but before Ibn Taymiyyah, also used this term wahdat al-wujud. That all of reality is divine. So Ibn Arabi, it's important to understand, it's always yes and no. We are not God and we are God. The world is God and not God. So you can't ever pin Ibn Arabi down. Ibn Taymiyyah knew that, but he didn't like the side of Ibn Arabi's thought where there's a certain divinization of the entire world, and he found this to be detrimental to the ethical life of Muslims. So, for example, there's a guy named Tilimsani, I forget.
Tilimsani, عفيف الدين التلمساني.
Thank you, Afaf ad-Din Tilimsani, who, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, said things like, basically, since everything is divine, it doesn't matter, if I have sexual relations with my mother and all kinds of, really things which are appalling to Ibn Taymiyyah and most other people as well. So, because if everything's divine, there's no difference between right and wrong. Everything is the same. So it just doesn't matter. So Ibn Taymiyyah finds this really revolting, and he finds behind those ideas Ibn Arabi, and he found that in Fusus al-Hikam.
There is a clear statement from عفيف الدين التلمساني about that مخالفة الشريعة is okay and such, or this is the interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah himself.
This is the interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah himself. I haven't read it Tilimsani, okay? But this is Ibn Taymiyyah's conclusions from looking into this. He's aware that Ibn Arabi was a very careful adherent of the Sharia, of the religion. He's aware of all that, but he says that the thought is the problem, and so we aren't going to we can't accept this thought floating about because it's leading to things like he thinks Tilimsani is saying and so forth.
So you're mentioning that he discovered that after Tilimsani is Ibn Arabi, and then
so basically Ibn Taymiyyah, let's take it from another angle. Why does Ibn Taymiyyah like Ibn Arabi, or why might have he liked Ibn Arabi? Ibn Arabi is equally dismissive of Kalam theology. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't like Kalam theology. Both figures see all of God's attributes as equal in you take the plain meaning of God's attributes. For example, God's anger doesn't have to be reinterpreted, neither for Ibn al-Arabi nor for Ibn Taymiyyah. You don't reinterpret that anger as, say, God's prohibition or something like that. There are several things that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Arabi share. One is this strong dislike of Kalam theology, because Kalam theologians look at some of God's attributes, like love, and they say God can't love because that involves emotions. God can't be angry because that involves boiling the blood, and that's involves bodily motion functions and so forth. So we have to reinterpret those things to mean God's will or something else that's not reminding us of bodily, some kind of bodily function. So that's an important point. There's a certain spirituality that they share, where you look at the richness of the Islamic practices. So Ibn Taymiyyah is not against, understanding prayer as some kind of connection with God and so forth. The big problem happens, though, is that Ibn Taymiyyah says God and the world are ontologically different, whereas for Ibn al-Arabi, God is, yes, different from the world and no different from the world. So there's a bit of ambiguity there.
تشبيه
Ibn Taymiyyah says no.
تشبيه في عين التنزيه.
Yeah, so you have to keep things separate. And then from that flows all of Ibn Taymiyyah's rejection of the annihilation of the self in God, the whole idea that that somehow we might become unified with God ontologically. For him, the annihilation that is proper is the annihilation of doing deeds for anyone but God. So all of our deeds are annihilated, which are devoted to other gods or other aims apart from the aims that God has given us. So he changes the meanings of certain Sufi terms to fit within his much more moralistic ethical framework. But he's I think it's another area to be studied in more depth is Ibn Taymiyyah's debt to Ibn al-Arabi. I haven't heard that he took whole swaths of Futuhat al-Makkiyya and put them in his own works and reworked them a little bit. I hadn't heard that. I haven't encountered that. He did quote directly from Ibn Arabi's writings in some of his refutations of Ibn Arabi, but I'd be curious to see these texts.
Interesting. And also interesting to know that he has a book about divine love, where if you read it, you totally discover that he's a mystic or a Sufi who's talking in the context of great mystics who are talking about divine love and the relation with God and the spiritual states towards God and the ethical view that's very deep and such. So although he was very aggressive against Wahdat al-Wujud or Sufism, but on the other hand, in the Suluki terms, you find him immersing in these terminologies and in these thoughts. So how come? Or he had different angles or manifestations of personality where sometimes when he's calm, he writes on the spiritual states towards God, and sometimes when he's aggressive.
No, is a profound consistency to Ibn Taymiyyah. And I need to clarify first that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya's works are much warmer, and he has his Madarij al-Salikin. Ibn Qayyim has his book Madarij al-Salikin, which has the Sufi stages. He has 100 different levels. It's a commentary on Manazil al-Sa'idin by al-Harawi, I believe.
Allah al-Ansari al-Harawi, who was a Hanbali also. Yeah.
So Ibn al-Qayyim is the one who is the professional, if you will, at taking Sufi terms and filling them with his own meaning. This is the key. What is the meaning that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim both are filling these terms with? It is what we might call a moral spirituality. So as I just said a moment ago, for Ibn Taymiyyah, the objective of the spiritual life is not annihilation of the self in God. It is rather annihilation of the will to do anything but what God wants us to do. So it is a will and a life totally devoted to doing the deeds that God wills us to do, that God commands us to do and prohibits us from doing. So that's the key difference. And once you've got that clear, then as they did, you can fill Sufi terms with all kinds of moral meaning. Just take the same words and write, as Ibn al-Qayyim did, very warm prose that explains and is really quite delightful to read at times, encouraging you on that journey of giving your whole life energy to God, not seeking this unity with God ontologically that we have in um, Sufism more broadly. So that's the key difference on my reading.
So here they intersect with many other Sufi and mystic scholars when they talk about وحدة الشهود, not وحدة الوجود. So not the ontological scholars, the others who are talking on the spiritual states until a person reaches himself to وحدة الشهود. So they intersect here with such people.
Well, Wahdat al-Shuhud as well, they would reject as at least misguided, because it's not about seeing God only. It's even that can lead you astray. It's about making sure that the wahda, if you will, is your religious devotion, your acts, your love for God. So Ibn Taymiyyah is really clear. In this book, you mentioned his Kitab al-Muhabba, I believe, his book on love. This is, it's about love. So what is love for Ibn Taymiyyah? We all have love. We are all beings who are active. We can't help but move. So the question for Ibn Taymiyyah is, and I should say additionally, we will never be joined with God ontologically. We will never be annihilated to ourselves such that we only see God. We can't escape ourselves. We will always be here in even physical form. And we will have energy. What do we do with that energy? That's the key question for Ibn Taymiyyah. That energy is love. We can have misguided love. We can have rightly guided love. So it's about giving our life energy, our love, to the right objective and working that out with the proper means. The means being the Sharia, the law of God. So, yeah, Ibn Taymiyyah is not interested. He does talk occasionally about deeper insights into the reality and so forth and understanding God, but that's not his main point. His main point is to get everybody worshiping God alone according to the law of Islam. And that's the key message in that book, by the way, Kitab al-Muhabba.
Interesting. I'd like here also to ask Professor about the annihilation of fire, فناء النار, and how come Ibn Arabi, with all his strictness, he believes in such a doctrine that the fire will end in a certain day. First of all, what's exactly his belief and the main proofs that he presented? And was he influenced from the Sufi ideas, and especially Ibn Arabi, or no, in this matter?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there is continuity here with Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah, as well as al-Ghazali. It's a whole, I'd like to go to the fundamental question that exists as well in other religions, and that is, what's the purpose of punishment? So even secular states have to ask this question. Why do states put people in prison? Why punish? Is it to give people what they deserve? In other words, if you commit a crime, if you steal something, you need to be punished because that's just what you deserve? Or do you need to be punished because you need to be reformed? You need to be taught how to live a better life, or you need to be trained how to live a better life. So, or maybe you need to be healed of some disease, which is moral disease, which is causing you to steal. So what's the purpose here of punishment? Retribution or reform and therapy? Moving to the question of hellfire. The mainstream Sunni belief is that unbelief in God and his messenger is of such great sin that it deserves eternal retribution. So retributive justice is the primary idea here. If reform and therapy were possible, you wouldn't have eternal hellfire, or you wouldn't have people in hellfire forever. Now, if you say actually the purpose of punishment is to reform people and to give them the therapy they need to live better and to live a more healthy life, then putting them in hellfire forever defeats the purpose of punishment. So to attain the purpose of punishment, if the purpose of punishment is therapy and reform, you've got to give them a chance to come out sometime. So these two philosophies of punishment are in play here. The dominant philosophy of punishment in the Sunni tradition is retribution. So unbelievers, hellfire for eternity. For Ibn al-Arabi, for Ibn Taymiyyah, the opposite retribution, or the opposite philosophy of punishments in play, that God's purposes, God's wise purposes, God's fundamental purpose is mercy, and God's fundamental purpose is that all people worship him. God did not create humankind and jinn, but to worship. So if that's God's purpose, and some people end up in hellfire forever, God's purposes will have been thwarted, will have been stopped. So Ibn Taymiyyah didn't work this out through the better part of his scholarly life, but at the end of his life, Ibn al-Qayyim presented him with a problem. I think it's the saying of, I forget the exact origin of this saying, but there's a saying from somebody in the Companions, I believe, that there's a time when everybody will come out of the fire. And there's something about the sand of Alij, which is some area around Mecca. If you take all that sand away, eventually there'll be a time when the fire ends. Sorry, I don't have the exact quotations. Ibn Taymiyyah, the first time he encountered this, he said, I'm not sure what this means. Or he said it's a big question. Ibn al-Qayyim went back and asked again. And then Ibn Taymiyyah wrote this short treatise on the question of the eternity, or rather the annihilation, Fanaء, of paradise and hellfire. He says paradise is not going to be annihilated, it's always going to be everlasting. But with hellfire, he gave arguments that, first of all, in the Quran, there's lots of expressions of the unbelievers being in hellfire, khalidina fiha abadan, they're going to be dwelling therein forever. But he says this is not absolute. There's another saying in the Quran, another part of the Quran, where I believe the unbelievers will be in the hellfire, labithina fiha ahqaban, or something like that. So periods of time, which doesn't mean forever, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. And other Sunnis will say ahqaban it means forever. It's just, that's another way of putting it. Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, this can be a finite period of time. So he pushes aside the Quranic evidence for the eternity.
Also, إلا ما شاء ربك, so he also used that.
Yeah, but he's okay, you make that conditional on God's will, but that means you don't know. Ibn al-Qayyim does that in two of his works. He says you don't know at the end. But Ibn Taymiyyah keeps pushing. Then he gives theological arguments, I call them, from God's mercy, God's wise purpose. As I already indicated, what wise purpose could God have for keeping people in hellfire forever, when his wise purpose is that everybody worship God alone? So there could be no use in punishing people forever. You punish people, the hellfire has its purpose, which is to purge people of their unbelief and purge people of their sins. But, what's the good of creating a creature and keeping it in hellfire forever? It destroys God's mission, if you will. He talks about God's mercy overcoming God's wrath. If we're going to take that seriously, God's wrath will have to eventually be extinguished. The other big thing is he opposes the Sunni consensus. This is actually extremely critical, because there were claims being made in his time that the Sunni tradition had come to consensus that unbelievers will spend eternity in hell. Ibn Taymiyyah says you can't get a consensus late in the tradition, because the Muslim population is spread throughout the world, and we can't get everybody together, if you will. He doesn't go into details, but basically it's not possible to get a consensus this late in the after the times of the companions and the Sahaba, and then the Salaf, rather, the early Muslims. So he says there was no consensus. First of all, he says the Sahaba, the companions, nobody said that hellfire is eternal, and that among the tabi'een, the followers, that there was difference of opinion. So there was no consensus among the Salaf. There was no consensus among the companions that hellfire is eternal, therefore we have no consensus on the matter. That leaves the door now completely open to argue another case, which he did, as I just explained earlier. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't come clearly in this treatise and say hellfire is going to expire. He doesn't say explicitly Fanaء and Nar, but all of his argumentation leads that way. He then, this treatise gets picked up in later writings by Ibn al-Qayyim and from about 1345 to 1348 in opposition to Taqi ad-Din as-Subki, who's writing against Ibn Taymiyyah. Taqi ad-Din as-Subki, a Shafi'i scholar of that time, wrote a direct refutation of Ibn Taymiyyah's short treatise. And Ibn al-Qayyim and Taqi ad-Din as-Subki were in competition and conflict over a number of issues at that time. Ibn al-Qayyim, in two of his works, Shifa al-Alil and Hadi al-Arwah, basically comes out and says, we leave this issue to God's will. But then in a later work, slightly later work, he comes down quite firmly. If you have understanding, Fanaء and Nar is what makes the most sense because of God's mercy and so forth. Then what happens is it seems that Taqi ad-Din as-Subki may have written this refutation of Ibn Taymiyyah's treatise because in even later writings, Ibn al-Qayyim no longer discusses Fanaء and Nar. He just says that some people are fair and fit for paradise and some people are foul and fit for hell, and leaves it at that. So it seems as-Subki, I use the term bullied, as-Subki seems to have intimidated Ibn al-Qayyim to stop talking about this Fanaء and Nar issue. It's a little bit off the topic of what you asked, but that gives you the historical context.
And it seems that the proof about divine mercy is the strongest in his argument. What do you think?
Well, you're asking my view. Yeah, it's a powerful argument. My own view on these things, from within my Christian framework, is that I hope that everybody will find everlasting salvation, but I would want to leave space for individual freedom to the degree that people could stay away from God if they wish. This is the danger in this Fanaء and Nar, and I write about this in an article in a 2018 edited volume. If God is able to eventually get everybody to worship him, that doesn't leave space for human freedom not to worship God. So I want to leave a little space for human freedom. You must say that a person has to be really, really stubborn and really, really anti-God to take such a position at the end of the day. But I want to leave room for utter human rebellion if somebody wants to rebel to that degree. Whereas Ibn Taymiyyah's logic is that God will eventually lead things such that all people worship him. Everybody will worship him.
I meant also, in your opinion, what do you think that the strongest proof that Ibn Arabi presented? So is it the divine mercy, or is it his understanding of the ayat al-Quran, or what?
So I haven't studied this aspect of Ibn al-Arabi sufficiently. To clarify, on what I understand from reading the works of others, Ibn al-Arabi doesn't actually talk about people leaving hellfire, but rather the hellfire becomes cool for them. So that's a bit different. But I can't say more about that.
No, in Ibn Taymiyyah. So do you believe that the strongest proof that he relied on was the proof that God is mercy and the most merciful?
Oh, in Ibn Taymiyyah's argumentation.
Yeah.
Well, I can't give you an answer. Again, it depends on a lot of what you believe, fundamental beliefs. I gave you, I believe that God wants to reform people and that God wants people to heal from their illnesses, whether that be moral or physical. But at the end of the day, I want to leave a little bit of room for retribution, if you want to put it that way.
So people are getting reformed and eventually they'll reach to a level where they're ready to be out of the hell or fire or punishment, in the view that Ibn Taymiyyah is presenting, that people will get what they deserve from the punishment, but then after that, God's mercy will be controlling everything. So that's why the hell will end.
Okay, so if we think about Ibn al-Qayyim, who works this out much more than Ibn Taymiyyah did, the purpose of hellfire is still within God's mercy, because if God weren't merciful, God might just consign somebody to hellfire forever. You know, that's that person's problem. But God is using hellfire to reform and purge people of their sins. So Ibn al-Qayyim sees hellfire as a type of medicine. He uses medicinal imagery to talk about the hellfire. It's a type of therapy, is another way of talking about it. So the purpose of hellfire is within the scope of God's mercy to enable people, to purify people, and he uses terms like purify, so that they are fit for the garden, the Jannah, for paradise, for heaven. Yeah, so that's the process.
Interesting, and I'll come back to this issue, how we feel some contradictory ideas in the doctrine of Ibn Taymiyyah, but I'd like to ask you here about God in the doctrine of Ibn Taymiyyah. So it's one of the main topics that's being discussed about Ibn Taymiyyah. So how do he understand God and how do he present him? Because many critiques on Ibn Taymiyyah, that he says that God has bodily or human attributes. He has a hand, he sits on the throne. He also, when he sits on the throne, there is a sound that comes out, and God is inside the time and space, and other stuff that they mention about it's true that Ibn Taymiyyah, he says he has a hand, but it's not like the human being hands. He has a body that is not. But at the end, many, even philosophers, when you're talking about Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadra, and you study these philosophies, and then you come back and read Ibn Taymiyyah, you feel, no, he's totally talking about tajssim. So after you studied Ibn Taymiyyah, how do you not defend him? How do you understand what he says about God and his doctrine about that?
Yeah, so Ibn Taymiyyah's view of God is fundamentally different from the Kalam tradition and the tradition of Falsafa and Hikmah. So then he's trying to make sure that people don't misunderstand him beyond that. You said, for example, that some people say God is in time. Another thing that one might be tempted to say is God is in space. So a more correct way of talking about this is that time emerges from God's activity as a natural concomitant or a necessary concomitant. So God is not in time. God is not outside time. God is not time, but rather time is a natural outflowing of God's activity. So God is perpetually active. I've worked this out in a number of my writings. God has been creating from eternity something or other. This is God's perfection. So let's talk about God's activity briefly. For the Kalam tradition, for Ibn Sina and the tradition of Falsafa, God is eternal in the sense that God is devoid of time. God is not active in the sense I'm moving my hands and I'm talking and all of that. If God were to move or God were to change, God would be moving away from God's perfection, because something is perfect cannot be, if it's changed, it's going to move toward imperfection. Ibn Taymiyyah turns all of that on its head and says that something that doesn't move, something that isn't active, is imperfect. So he's quite modern in this sense, that perfection does not consist in a kind of perfect sphere. Perfection consists in activity, motion, doing things. And he says this is more perfect than a God who is inactive. So he will say, he'll criticize the Ash'aris, for example, who say that God creates with his will, but God's will is eternal, and God's will is not, and God's knowledge, God has known everything that's ever going to happen, never has happened in God's eternal knowledge, and so forth. Ibn Taymiyyah says this is all very static. You cannot get temporality out of eternity of that kind, out of timeless eternity. And that's imperfect. You've got a God who is basically, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, static, still, imperfect, inactive, which to his mind is an imperfect, even dead being. So you have to understand that he's turning everything around when it comes to time. Similarly with space. So God is not in space, God is not outside space, but rather space derives from God's very essence and nature. So he doesn't like to talk about, so the word for spatially extended, which in the Kalam tradition is tahayyuz or mutahayyuz, he doesn't like using those words, but then he has this idea also, if the Kalam theologians don't, if he doesn't use their terms, he'll never get it. So he uses their terms, but he wants to fill them with meaning of his own. Now, let me finish the idea here. God is active, and so there's time coming out of, time derives from God. God is, in some sense, spatial. In that space, God is spatial. Let's keep it that way. And spatiality is of God's essence. It's not that God is above space or God is in space. If God were inside of space, space would be bigger than God, and Ibn Taymiyyah rejects that out of hand. Now, corporeality. I showed in my article on God spatially above and spatially extended 2022, it's open access online, that what God is, or whether what Ibn Taymiyyah, he understands God, if he works everything out, as a very large being at the center of which there is a cavity, if you will, which is the universe. So God is not in the universe. As I said much earlier, God and creation are ontologically separate. But God completely surrounds the universe. And God is spatially extended. I don't use the word spatial, I don't use occupying space or space occupying, because that would imply that God is occupying something bigger than God, but that's not the case. God is spatially extended, and then there's this space in the middle of God, which is empty, and that's where the universe sits. So if you're inside the universe, as we are, and you look up, you're always going to be looking toward God. So the idea that God is always above is easy to make sense of. Fakhruddin Razi, who is the big Ash'ari theologian Ibn Taymiyyah is interacting with on these questions, has this argument that, these ideas, he was encountering them earlier with the Karamis and the Kalami theologians and earlier Hanbali theologians. God is up in a very, just as I'm looking up. So Razi said this is so silly, so irrational, because if we think about the world as a sphere, as round, and we have a person on the east looking one direction, they look up, they see God looking out to the east, and we have another person on the west, and they look up, they're looking in the opposite direction, so they're not going to see God. Or if they're going to see God, they're going to have to look the other way toward the east, down to the ground, and so God's going to be under the ground for them. So this is ridiculous that God should be, and anything should be spatially extended, should have anything to do with space. Ibn Taymiyyah says no, doesn't work that way. If we have somebody on the east of the earth and somebody on the west of the earth, and they both look up, what do they see? They see the sky. And they don't say that the person on the east sees the sky up and the person on the west sees the sky looking down. No, they're both looking up. Likewise with God. So to make this work spatially, you need to imagine God is completely surrounding the universe, and then it works fine. The what you said there about God and the throne, I haven't studied that material adequately to speak to it.
No,
What
in
I
general, التجسيم. So he has a hand, he has a throne, he has a ساق, and all these stuff, and how he understands it. And is it as the criticizers say that it's a تجسيم, it's a not logical, and it's a very narrow view about, and he hasn't understanding the deep philosophical and mystical approaches and proofs about God, and he's presenting him in such a way.
yeah. Okay, so he doesn't really explain what God means to have a hand, at least in what I've read. He just says God has a hand. It's not like our hands. But he does have a hand. But I forgot to clarify an important issue here. Ibn Taymiyyah and the word tajsim. Very, very important distinctions here to be made. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects the word tajsim for his own theology if you understand by tajsim something that has to be composed from parts. So an argument Ibn Fakhruddin Razi and other Kalam theologians say, God has to be simple. God cannot be spatial, because if God were spatial, God would be composed of parts. And God, if God were of a certain size, you could chop that. If God were a block, you could chop up the block, you can take it apart, you can put it back together. And so God cannot be composed. God cannot be assembled. So Ibn Taymiyyah say, I reject that meaning of tajsim, and that's the dominant meaning of tajsim according to the Kalam theologians. He says, if you mean by tajsim something else, it's okay. And that is that God is spatially extended, but God cannot be chopped up. God has certainly not been assembled from parts. God is one unit, spatially extended. And that is okay. He says this rarely, but he does acknowledge it, that if you're going to talk about jism that way, he has to accept. He doesn't like to talk about the word jism because it's not the Quran, not the Hadith, and so forth. But if we must talk about the word jism and tajsim, he would allow that meaning, that God is spatially extended, is a large, huge being. God is huge. God is so huge that we cannot even imagine how huge God is. Nonetheless, God is one, and God cannot be divided. God cannot be composed. God has not been composed. So this is to say that Ibn Taymiyyah's critics are onto something. He has in my view, and some people struggle when I say this, but on my reading, his ontology, his understanding of of who God is fundamentally different from the Kalam tradition. He's not Platonist in the broadest of terms. He is, if I may use the word, materialist.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that exists must be potentially seen, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled. Everything is accessible to the five senses. Now you might say God's not accessible to the five senses. He believes in the hereafter we will see God as, we see the moon on a moonlit night. So God is not accessible to us now, to our eyes, but God will be in due time, in the hereafter. Angels and all even our souls we don't have an immaterial soul. Now, our soul is not something you can see, but it is nonetheless material. It's extracted from us when we die. And if we have, in certain circumstances, we could perhaps see it, but it's a subtle material, if you will. So he doesn't go into detail on this stuff as much as we might like, but it's all there. I'm of the view that we cannot explain it away as bila kaif and all that kind of stuff. It's a fundamentally different view of reality than the dominant, what is dominant within both Sunni tradition and the Shia traditions, that's strongly Platonized, that there's a something that is beyond the material world. So for Kalam theologians,
transcendent, not material, مجرد من المادة
yeah, exactly. So for the Kalam traditions, it's God who's immaterial. For philosophers, there's a whole realm of immateriality, the one and the first and the intellects and all that. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, at the end of the day, everything is empirically accessible in certain circumstances.
So, at the end of the day, in summary, he holds this materialistic view about God. So he is something, he's a jism, he's large, he's a substance at the end, هو أمر مادي. So how come he's unlimited and then he's, does he understand him as a object that's very big and huge and powerful? Is this how he's understanding him? And this is a مضحك, as we say in Arabic, so.
Do you want to translate mudhak? I mean, it sounds like related to laughter.
Yeah, أمر مضحك, so it's
Yeah.
مثير للسخرية.
Matter.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it's not a laughing matter to him.
it matter to any person who has a mind and he's.
Okay, he would ask the question, what kind of mind, what kind of presuppositions are we talking about here? So if you are a materialist, what is mudhik is the idea that there's something exists that you can't access with your five senses. He flips it around. And so he, and if you think that God is inaccessible, is some kind of immaterial being or something like that, this is basically tantamount to saying God doesn't exist. So we have to be careful to work within his frame of reference. He's seeing the world differently from the broad mainstream of the classical and post-classical Islamic tradition, because it's been Platonized. He would argue, and that's part of his big argument, the whole tradition's been Platonized or philosophized in ways which are moving God out of existence, moving God away from us, to the point of being non-existent. And he does accuse certain, falsafa and so on. At the end of the day, their God doesn't exist. It's just a figment of their imagination. So
he comes close to Sufism and Ibn Arabi, because also in the Sufi doctrine, he disagrees with وحدة الوجود, but then they also say that God is close, وهو معكم أينما كنتم وهو أقرب إليكم من حبل الوريد, and they have a view that God is very close to us and He's in everywhere. So he critiques them, that he understands that they say God and we are the same, but from the other hand, I think he agrees and comes close to them when they are trying to say that God's close to humans, or no?
No, for him, God is only close to us in knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I need to finish the point here. So Ibn Taymiyyah is Aristotelian in a certain sense, that you cannot have an infinite extension. You can't have a surface or a body which is infinitely extended. So in Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, which is his refutation of Fakhruddin Razi's Ta'sis al-Taqdis is a refutation of Karami and Hanbali views that God is somehow perhaps bodily or whatever. In Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah in one place affirms that God is finite in extension. He's not infinite. So how can we understand that? So in Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Aristotle, and so forth, you cannot have an infinite extension. And Ibn Taymiyyah believes that. So that doesn't mean there's space beyond God, because you can have in Ibn Rushd and this whole way of thinking, you can have an end to space, as it were. Space isn't infinite. When you get beyond, there's no vacuum. That's the word I'm looking for. There's no spatial extension means that there's always something. So there's this question in the history of philosophy, can there be a vacuum? Something completely empty. For Ibn Taymiyyah, for Ibn Rushd, for Aristotle, no. So once you get beyond God, you can't talk. There's nothing beyond God. And you can't talk like that. There's simply nothing to say. So you have everything below God, and God is above everything. But we here in this world are surrounded by God, but God is not close to us ontologically, God or physically, because God is above the heavens. God is close to us in knowledge. God knows our affairs. God is creating our affairs, and so forth. So it's not Sufism. It's a unique sort of Hanbali traditionalism, or I call it spatialism, to give it a new category, because it's conceiving God in spatial terms. Ibn Taymiyyah, I need to underline this very, very firmly. He's very, very, very reticent. He doesn't want to talk like this. He's only talking like this because he's trying to explain to Kalam theologians and people who read his stuff that this is what I really mean. What's it really mean when we say God is above the throne and God is above the heavens? And this is how it works out. But he's not that interested in elaborating that too much, but he has to get past Fakhruddin Razi's arguments, because Fakhruddin Razi's arguments are very powerful. So yeah, it's a whole different paradigm for understanding God and creation from what you get in Kalam theology, from what you get in Ibn Rushd, from what you get in Ibn Sina, and Shi'i tradition, Mullah Sadra, Alam al-Hilli, and so forth. And I think that, if I may say, the difficulty here is that people do come along and say this is absolute rubbish because it doesn't fit our ideas of what is obviously true. Ibn Taymiyyah would come back and say, well, what is obviously true is governed by a certain Platonic tradition. Platonic here understood in the broadest of terms, to include even Aristotle. That there's something immaterial. And if you take that away, then my system makes the most sense. And he's arguing, he's arguing at the end of the day that his approach to theology and his approach to God is more rational, is the Quranic rationality, is more rational than all this other stuff. So it's really profound, it's really deep, and it's I think it cuts to the core of ontological differences within the Islamic tradition. Whether it cuts to the core, Razi raises at the end of his Tasis al-Taqdis, does this mean it's kufr? Does it mean it's unbelief if you don't think like he does? And I forget what he says exactly, but I don't think he comes down and says absolutely it's unbelief. But if it comes down to that kind of issue, I think we have to raise the question, is that Platonized tradition on the only way to believe or not? I'm speaking not as a Muslim theologian, as an outsider, but I raised it as a question for Muslim theologians. How big is the church? How big is the ummah? Can this be included, this type of thinking? And historically, what's happened is that Ibn Taymiyyah's way of thinking, especially in his own day, and then subsequently has been squelched. I think it was Ben Baz, who was in Saudi Arabia. I think he died in 1999. But he didn't want people to read Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, this work that I've been talking about, that Ibn Taymiyyah wrote, because it's just, it's not for the simple people. I don't know. Rather, we should just affirm God's attributes and that they are without kaifiyya, they're without modality, and keep it at that. Because if we go into all that theological argumentation, we end up in the stuff I'm talking about, which is really quite mind-stretching, even mind-blowing.
My final question here about the God's doctrine in Ibn Taymiyyah's view will be, I quote him, he says, whatever cannot be sensed by the five senses is nothing but a non-existent. So is this something similar to the materialistic logic where some Western philosophies believe in? So some Western philosophers believe that there is no God, and that they don't have any metaphysical approach towards these realities. They're totally materialistic. So Ibn Arabi, by this way, does he come close to them? So he's a believer. He believes in God and Prophet and the Quran and the day after. But then he's using his materialistic understanding and applies it to God. So what differentiates him from the other materialistic people here? And then he also claims that God can be seen in the our dreams
Yeah,
and hereafter.
I
So
think you're,
so he transformed God to something that can be seen. So to a material thing.
yeah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, I think you've just answered the question, really. Yes, there's a lot of similarities with modern materialisms, with the key difference that he believes in God, and he has a way of understanding God within his materialistic framework. So he provides a way to believe in God for materialists, to put it very simply.
So that's a good point for materialistic people, huh? To read him and maybe they'll become believers.
I leave that to others to, I mean, that's an individual faith decision and about how you understand reality, how you understand God, religion, philosophy, and so forth.
One last point that
I would,
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
One last point that should be tackled when talking about Ibn Taymiyyah is the issue of takfir, tafsiq, tadlil, and whatever he dislikes, he calls it a bid'ah, and he makes the other person or scholars who believes in this idea a kafir, and then his blood will be يعني يحل دمه, and this is the whole issue of takfir that came and later with Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and all the analysis which says that the terrorist groups, whether Qaeda, whether Takfiri people, whether Daesh in modern days, they rely on Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas. But before that, before the social impacts of this idea, why he's very harmful to all other ideas? So from where he derived this harmful personality where he attacks all other people who are against his ideas? You can attack them in your ideas, okay, they are wrong, but he doesn't only state they are kafir, but they should be killed even.
Sure. First of all, it's important to understand that those particular instances which people pick up on to justify takfir today and so forth, and their blood is licit, they're very rare in his writings, so you can find them, but that's not the dominant tone. The dominant tone is careful consideration of other people's ideas, and then his admittedly quite forceful and long, typically very long, defense of his views and refutation of their views. So it's one thing to hear about Ibn Taymiyyah's reputation. It's another thing to actually read him over a long period of time. And you realize that he cuts to key issues quite quickly. But sometimes it takes him a long time to get there. And he doesn't write in an organized fashion, but he is trying to be fair. He knows a lot about his opponents. He's trying to be as fair as he can within his particular framework. And he is very reticent to declare somebody a kafir. It happens rarely. Where it does happen, in a key instance, is in a fatwa against the Mongols, which he probably wrote in 1309, 1310, 1311, something like that. It's his longest anti-Mongol fatwa, where he basically equates them with apostates, mortadun. So if you pick up that particular text and expand it to his, and think that's his whole view, then you get this distorted view of his thinking and his way of proceeding. So it depends where you look. He was a forceful personality. He was a bit eccentric. There's no doubt about that. Some people found him just too much. Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi has written about Ibn Taymiyyah. Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi is a hadith scholar of the same period in the same community, scholarly community. And he has written about Ibn Taymiyyah's eccentricities and just weird behavior sometimes. But Ibn Taymiyyah really could not afford to be too radical because the authorities wouldn't put up with it. He was very shrewd. He was very careful not to say more than he needed to say or could say without getting in trouble. Sometimes he obviously did get in trouble, but yeah, I think we have to put aside this image of Ibn Taymiyyah as a totally hateful man. Rather, he's a man deeply persuaded by his own perspective. He's working it out. He doesn't have everything figured out from his early days. He's working it out, and you pick that up like the Fanaء and Nar issue. He only writes about it at the end of his life, carefully. So he's a human being like the rest of us who was very passionate about his mission. And like many people are passionate about their missions, they sometimes do things which are a bit odd and perhaps wrong. But I wouldn't call him somebody who hated people as a matter of principle.
And at the end, the final point that I'd like to ask you about it. So when reading Ibn Taymiyyah's writings and books and all what he left for us, can we discover a focal point that gathers all his writings in fiqh, kalam, tafsir, akhlaq, mantiq, and all the stuff that he wrote, or no, he has many different ideas and thoughts here and there, and some contradict each other, and so he's like many other famous and great scholars who left different pages and books. Or no, we can see معالم لمشروع متكامل. So when you're talking about Mullah Sadra, you know the main points. When you're talking about Ibn Sina, you know the main points. So when you're talking about Ibn Taymiyyah, how you can summarize his main thoughts in which direction?
Yeah, so first it needs to be said his corpus of writings is very diffuse. He doesn't write systematic treatises. Usually it's fatwas and refutations, so it can look like it's very even contradictory at times. But there is a core issue, there's a core concept, and that is ibadah. He wants everybody to worship God alone. And you might say, well, isn't that just Islam? Isn't that what everybody's after as well? But it's his particular way of talking about it, what he means by that. That is unique. So we go back to about devoting one's whole life energies, one's love toward God alone, and then worshiping God strictly by the Sharia as Ibn Taymiyyah conceives it. And that's the core that gets at everything. Now, why is he doing all this theological work? Because he thinks that the Kalam theologians, for example, are distorting the view of God and therefore making God less praiseworthy, less worship-worthy, you might say, and so that's detracting from worship. So if worship is at the center, anything that detracts from worship, Ibn Taymiyyah is opposing that.
Like visiting the shrines of saints and other stuff, and tawassul and this stuff.
Yes. So all that's detracting from his view of what the Sharia says, and therefore it's detracting from the proper worship of God. Therefore, he opposes it.
And about Tajdid and Fatawa, you call it innovation, and so he was totally against Tajdid and going back to the Salaf. But did you discover in your studies some fatwas which shows his special new approach to certain Fatawa and stuff, or no, he was totally against any kind of innovation and making the fiqh what you call flexible with the struggles of the day and such?
Very good question, and I'm not the expert on this topic. I think his answer would be that the Sharia, well, I know his answer is that Sharia includes all benefit. However, we need to work out what that means in our time. So in that sense, yes, we need to think about how to apply the law today. Whether that what that would look like, I can't know. So let's put it this way. There are resources within Ibn Taymiyyah to support a wide range of approaches to this question of tajdid in the law. in that he focuses on benefit, and we need to do what is beneficial for religion. I mean, he's very much focused on worship of God alone, and all benefit fundamentally leads to that worship. All benefit is worshiping God alone, so it all goes together. So, yeah, I prefer not to go into detail there because I really don't know. It can look different ways. I'll leave it at that.
Great, Professor. Being you also worked on the relations between Muslim and Christians. So, have Ibn Taymiyyah does he have anything to say in the relation to his view about Ahl al-Kitab Christians? So he was very negative about them, or no? He had an open view about other people and how he perceives them. Because we talked about his salvation view and Fanaء and Nar. So, in his writings, did he perceive other people with a positive view and an interaction, or no? He was very strict.
Okay, so you're making a move which is quite common these days. If somebody believes that all people eventually, including non-Muslims, will be saved, that means the person must be generous of heart and really, open-minded. With Ibn Taymiyyah, it doesn't work that way. It's all about God, bringing God's purposes to fullness. That is, every human being, all creation worshiping God alone. The process can be quite brutal. I mean, if you're talking about an unbeliever in hell a very long time, that's a very, very painful process. And it's not nice. In this world, Ibn Taymiyyah also is of the view that sometimes force can be useful in helping improve people's religious adherence. So that means that sometimes the authorities, in his view, can force people to do things they might not want to do to improve the overall religious character of society. When it comes to Christians in particular, of course, he wrote his large work, Jawab Sahih, Liman Baddala Din al-Masih, so the correct answer to those who have changed the Christ religion. It's the largest refutation of Christianity in the Islamic tradition. And in there, again, as with other groups, he's quite careful in understanding and interacting with Christian ideas. But at the end of the day, he doesn't see Christianity he doesn't see it generously. He sees it as wrong. He sees it as an example of what Muslims should avoid. So does that make sense of his approach?
Yeah, a totally false religion which has been abrogated and even تم تحريفها, so it's totally false and mistake. If some Islamic ideas are bid'ah, what about other religions? It's a bid'ah. Yeah. I started with a personal question. I'll leave you with a personal question. So, in just a few minutes, if you'd state the most interesting angle, idea, thought for you personally from Islamic theology or Islamic philosophy or Islamic studies in general.
That's a difficult question. This whole idea of God being spatially extended is challenging. And, what does one do with that theologically? That is a thought which is, it's very challenging. In terms of attraction, if you're asking that question, what I'm attracted to, it is this in Ibn Taymiyyah and other aspects, other parts of the Islamic tradition, this very wholehearted devotion to God is very attractive. And, you find that in Sufism. Kalam theology can be a bit dry. I enjoy Kalam theology. I enjoy philosophy. But at the end of the day, it's about, what we do with our lives and who we worship. And so what I find within Islamic thought is a very clear idea that we should worship God alone. Ibn Taymiyyah says it, and others say it too. So I find that very attractive.
Thank you very much for being with us, for your time, for sharing this knowledge.
You're welcome.